Okay, so we're going to start to make a bit of a transition in this class, so away from some of the early topics that might be broader looks at contemporary political issues, things like taxes and government and budgets and income inequality, and now move a little bit to maybe more traditional introduction to American government classes. So today we're going to talk on the founding or the founding period. And we'll go through some issues that actually the questions that we're going to talk about today still resonate through today, which is part of the reason why I think it's important to talk about this topic. But before we jump in, I think it's important to talk a little bit about, so, we're going to talk about some of the founders. And so it's important to say, like, let's be clear, like some of these founders and many of them were very flawed individuals. And most of them owned slaves. If you look at this picture that circulated recently, it's a very famous picture. All of the founders with red dots on their faces were slave owners. So almost all of people considered the founders, and this is the Constitutional Convention, were slave owners, and slave labor was used to build our country. It's also important to point out sort of the ideals of the founding, this idea that, all men are created equal, were clearly not consistent with actions, right? So rhetoric and behavior did not match up. But I think some of these questions that we'll talk about today about the sort of the founding time are still relevant. So the questions about the role of government, questions about, how should we set our government up? Those are questions that are still asked and debated today. So we'll jump right in here. We'll talk about some of the founders and then some of the issues. So first there's Washington, and on some of these slides I have an age up here, and this is the age of these people at the Revolution. So at 1776, if I did my math right, on the age of some of these folks. And so Washington was sort of like an older founder, I guess. And so he was 44 at the time of the Revolution, which is how old I am. So just sort of to, help put that in context. Generally, the founders were pretty young. We sort of thinking back in time, we see them in the wigs and whatnot and think they're like, these old folks. But generally they were pretty young. So Washington was a Virginia planter. He served in the British military on the French and Indian War. So, and some of the early generals served in the British military. That's where they got their training. So there's some, I think it's the Battle of the Wilderness that Washington was at. Actually, that did not turn out so well. So he commanded the American Army during the Revolution. I don't know, sort of, I'm not a historian of military strategy. My sort of, lay reading of the Revolutionary War is Washington's strategy was basically, we'll just wait out the British. And so there's a lot of retreats. And what he did was the idea of like, eventually the British will give up. And no, they kind of did. I mean, there were some victories in the war. A lot of it was just, we just wait long enough. This picture here is Washington turning in his commission at the end of the war. So there's a longer history, if you look back, about revolutions where whoever's in charge of the army then goes on to become the leader of the country, and Washington does. He becomes president. But it's important to know he does this as a civilian. So the war's over and he turns in his commission. This is actually in the Annapolis courthouse. You can still go in this building. The room looks still pretty much like this. Washington was the president of the Constitutional Convention. Although he actually made like very few intellectual contributions, I think, to the founding and the writing of the Constitution. Probably the biggest contribution he made was determining the number of representatives. I think it was 33,000 that would be in each congressional district. So he kind of came up with a number, and people said, "All right, we'll go with it." Washington himself is a pretty interesting character. They were talking about the revolution, and they had some of these earlier meetings, and it came time to decide like who would be the general. Washington actually showed up in his own like homemade military uniform. So who should be the general? This guy walks in, tall, wearing a military uniform. Like, he looks good, he should work. But he was also like very wealthy and did have military experience. So people sort of looked up to him as a leader, although he wasn't one of the, he wasn't like Jefferson, he wasn't like Madison or Hamilton making the, I think the intellectual contributions to our founding. But people agree, for the most part, agreed that he would be a good leader. And obviously he's the first president. Alexander Hamilton is very young, 21 at the time of the Revolution. So that's your age. So think about you as a leader, right, in this movement. So very young when it happens. If you've seen the play, right, he's the bastard son of a Scotch peddler from the West Indies. So you can sort of look at the map here, and the community pays for his education. So that's a very, if you think about it, like a very socialist thing to do, right? The community will pay for someone's education, which is interesting if you understand Hamilton. Hamilton is very much a capitalist. He organized some of the early sort of economy of the US, or how the government should be involved in the economy. And one of his contributions was the idea that, and this is borrowed from economists at the time, but that capital should be concentrated, right? So the wealth in the country, it's better to be concentrated. That way people can, the capitalists can make use of that money. So sort of this socialism paying for his education, but his intellectual contributions, this idea of we want to concentrate wealth. And as you know, wealth is very concentrated today. He was sort of an aide de camp to Washington. So, during the war, he would sort of helped Washington. He, I think, was involved in maybe 1 or 2 battles because he really wanted to, but, was sort of Washington's right-hand man, I guess. He co-wrote the Federalist Papers. So the Federalist Papers are these series of articles that originally appeared sort of in New York media, trying to convince people to vote in favor of ratifying the Constitution. And so, he sort of had a full-time law practice, was writing these Federalist Papers. So basically, I think, never slept and it was always working. He was present at the Constitutional Convention. So unlike Thomas Jefferson, so he was there and was involved in a lot of the debates. Although some of the New York, so he was a delegate from New York to the convention, some of the New York delegates left because they didn't agree with what was happening. He was a Treasury Secretary, so Federalist. So the 2 early parties are the Federalists and then the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists favored a stronger federal government with sort of broader powers. And one thing he favored was the assumption of state debts. So during the war, individual states ran up a lot of debt. And he thought the federal government should assume those debts and pay them off rather than having the states pay the debts off themselves. There's this whole story about like Thomas Jefferson has this dinner where they come to agreement that the capital will be in Washington, D.C., and then the federal government will assume state debts. Lurking in the background is they fiddled with the number some. So Virginia, it actually already paid off some of his debts. It ends up coming out a little better than some of the other states. But anyways, he thought the federal government should do this. And actually the idea behind this is if the federal government pays off state debts, then they would build credit. The same way you think about like, as someone your age perhaps, you should take out a credit card, charge a little bit and pay it off so you can get good credit. So think about back to the mortgage lecture, the better your credit, the lower your interest rate will be. So Hamilton understood that the federal government will need good credit in order to take out loans and then it can do things. We won't really get into this too much, but this idea of like, should we build infrastructure in the US? And so the federal government would potentially borrow to do that. And so it needed better credit to have lower interest rates. So other people would lend the US money to do this. Hamilton is killed by Aaron Burr in a duel. So there's this other picture. This is like a very historically inaccurate picture. If you sort of read accounts of duels, most people would, if you're not involved in the duel, you would turn your back. Dueling's illegal, so you would turn your back so you could say like, well, I didn't see it happen. Also in the background here is this carriage, but if you read accounts of this, they sort of rowed the boat somewhere to I think it's in New Jersey to have the duel. And then there's all sorts of questions of like, did Hamilton fire in the air? Did Burr just shoot him? anyways, he's killed by Burr in a duel. And remember, Burr is vice president at this time, right? He's not just like this other guy, right? So he's a VP. Starred Broadway play. I saw it in Oklahoma City. It's pretty good. Maybe some of you watched it when it was on TV, but I don't know, pretty good play. Another founder, Thomas Jefferson, so also like fairly young at the time of the Revolution, so 33. Another sort of Virginia planter, gets credit as an author of the Declaration of Independence. Again, like this is not really, I wouldn't say it's historically inaccurate, but it's not like he sat down and he's like, okay, let me draft this, and then like he showed it off to everyone. Like there's lots of discussion about what should appear in this, and then he took the discussion and sort of put it into this language, and there were still corrections and whatnot. So John Adams gets upset that that Jefferson gets all the credit for the Declaration of Independence. One thing that Jefferson and actually other founders are pretty good at, but especially Jefferson, is making sure their legacy like sort of was carried forward. So they would curate their letters. And so this is, everyone communicated via letter, right? There's no internet or telephone. And so they would keep copies of letters they write. Lots of letters were supposed to be for public consumption, right? They'd be published in newspapers. So they would sort of curate, they would destroy ones that looked bad and make sure to keep ones that made themselves look good. So anyways, Jefferson was very good at promoting himself. Secretary of State under Washington. And actually, like Jefferson is in France for a lot of things that are going on during the founding. He was the founder of the Democratic, along with Madison, of the Democratic Republican Party. So this is the party that's opposite of the Federalist Party. And the current Republican Party can trace its roots back to the Democratic Republican parties, sort of. They were in favor of small government, although at the same time when Jefferson was president, he sort of approved the Louisiana Purchase, which is not a very small government thing. Thomas Jefferson is very good at sort of writing out things in an ideal world, but had really no worries with his actions contradicting his writings. He's vice president under Adams, and Adams and Jefferson are rivals, part of different parties, right? This is back when the person who got the most votes is in the Electoral College is president, second most votes becomes vice president. So what you would, so they fixed it very quickly, routinely have the president and vice president being of different parties, and this didn't really work for Jefferson. He sort of just like disappears. Well, he doesn't disappear. He goes back home during the Adams presidency. He's like, well, I have nothing to do here. So he left. And then becomes president himself after Adams. Jefferson is generally pro-France and anti-Hamilton. So the real rivalry is with Hamilton, less so with Adams, I think. And then he's founder of the University of Virginia. Fun fact, so Jefferson wrote his own Bible. So we like to think, I don't know, some people like to think, the sort of religion in our country traces back to the founders. Not a religious scholar, but I think a lot of people take issue with the way some of our founders practice religion. Like, yeah, Washington was part of a church, but I think it was mostly for like business reasons. He was like, it's like being part of the country club. Jefferson writes his own Bible, where he literally took the Bible and cut and paste parts that he agreed with. So he like removes the miracles from the Bible and leaves other parts in. So he writes his own Bible. So again, I'm not a religious scholar, but I think like it's not really allowed, right? To like, hey, I'm just going to edit the Bible as I see fit. But anyways, Jefferson did that. Sort of very much an intellectual. John Adams. Adams is from a prominent Massachusetts family. So the Hamilton is mostly from New York, although not born there. Others from Virginia. Adams is from Massachusetts, one of the other sort of like homes of the Revolution. He pushed for independence early on, so the Continental Congress. So the Continental Congress is sort of one of these first meetings where delegates from the different colonies came together to debate, what should we do as a country? So I say quasi-federalist. He's probably more on the federalist side than the anti-federalist side. He likes to think he's independent, but probably more on the federalist side. Again, the federalist government favored more powers and broader powers to the national government, whereas the Democratic Republican Party favored fewer powers in the federal government. Sort of more powers to the states is probably a way to think about it. We'll, I think, talk about that in a second more. Helped draft the Declaration of Independence, and Maddie doesn't get credit. He's like always mad. Anything you read about Adams, he's just like mad all the time. Not a very pleasant individual. You know, he's the father to John Quincy Adams, who also goes on to be president, and you know, put tremendous pressure on his son. Basically, I forget if it was John or Abigail Adams that writes John Quincy Adams a letter when he's very young. It's basically like, look, if you don't go on to become president, like we'll consider you a failure in life. And then they pack John Quincy Adams off as, maybe he's like 12 or 13. Like, you're going to be like the private secretary to this, someone who's a representative to Prussia. So basically, like, you're going to go off to Eastern Europe as a teenager. Have fun. This is a time when like travel over the Atlantic is not safe. Adams is vice president under Washington and goes on to be the president, serves one term. Adams signs the Alien and Sedation Acts. So the Alien and Sedation Acts basically said, if you speak out against the government, we can lock you up, which goes up very much against thinking about the First Amendment, freedom of expression, but sign these anyways. Thought is like, it's our national interest to do this. Sort of we're at war with the British, and so this is an easier thing to do. And like, yeah, he's very cranky. He's like, he tries to write his own autobiography and just ends mid-sentence because he's just angry about something. James Madison, also very young. Another Virginia planter. Jefferson sees Madison as his protege. Madison sees himself as an equal to Jefferson. So you can read that as you want. The author of the Bill of Rights, and these are actually largely borrowed from some things from Virginia that he wrote, considered the father of the Constitution. So he was one of the leaders at the Constitutional Convention. Although if you actually sort of read the history of the convention, Madison doesn't get most of what he wants. So Madison is the intellectual force behind the sort of the Virginia plan, so to speak. And we'll learn about that in the next lecture on the Constitution, but most of that does not end up in the Constitution. So he wanted an extremely strong legislative branch, and that would be popularly elected. And then the legislative branch would pick the president and other chambers and the courts. And as you know, we don't end up with that. So we end up with a popularly elected House. But the president's elected electoral college. The Senate at the time is the state legislatures pick the senators and so on. So anyways, we think of him as the father of the Constitution, and he did have a lot of the intellectual thought behind it, but a lot of his ideas never make it into the Constitution. Co-wrote the Federalist Papers along with Hamilton, and actually John Jay writes a couple, but John Jay, who we won't talk about, gets ill at the time of the Federalist Papers. So again, the Federalist Papers, Madison and mostly Hamilton, are trying to convince the delegates who are going to ratify the Constitution that they should do it. So, and lots of times the Supreme Court or others might reach back to the Federalist Papers to think about what were the founders thinking. But it's important to note that like the founders disagreed on lots and lots of things. So if someone ever says the founders said, ask them which one, because lots of times they're contradictory. So, Madison and Hamilton might want the exact opposite, or sometimes they agreed. Perhaps it depended on the issue. And there's other people which think of as founders, like Roger Sherman, who doesn't get very much credit, but sort of led the opposition to Madison at the convention, who had, was opposite views on tons of things. And if you read the chapters that are assigned, what were the founders really for, you get a little bit of the idea of the disagreement that we had. Along with Jefferson, he's founder of the Democratic Republican Party, Secretary of State under Jefferson. So a lot of these founders sort of serve in these key roles of the government at the beginning, and then goes on to be president. Actually a fairly not great president. Okay, so some similarities about the founders, probably all guilty of treason, right? So they're trying to overthrow the British rule. They all thought pretty highly of themselves, right? Like imagine sitting around and like, yeah, we can overthrow the British. Yeah, they're this like this global empire, but like, yeah, we're good, we can do it. So you have to think pretty highly of yourself to think you can be successful at it. Mostly from important families. You know, Hamilton is the key difference here. There's probably some others. And most actually married up. So, you know, Washington, a lot of his wealth comes from his marriage to Martha. So if you study any of the like inheritance laws, so there's a lot of death, right? So like people get married, then when the husband dies, if the wife remarries, the new husband basically gets all that wealth. And so Washington gets some wealth this way. John Adams marries into a wealthy family. Hamilton marries into a wealthy family. So a lot of their, maybe had some wealth. Hamilton had very limited, comes from their marriage. Anyways, most of them sort of married up. The founders were willing to compromise. And so I think that's one key difference between the founders is on some issues, especially at the Constitutional Convention, they were willing to compromise. And part of that had to do with the fact they would just allow things to come to a vote. They would vote on it and say, okay, that was the outcome. I guess that's what we're dealing with. That doesn't mean they didn't try to fight it or maybe try to change things later, but they were willing to compromise on key issues. And then on some issues, especially slavery, they were willing to say like, well, let's just agree not to talk about this. So let's take this issue where we know we disagree and we'll push it to a side and let the status quo reign, right? Obviously not a good thing, but there were some issues that they just pushed off the table. They also had no idea about the outcome, right? Like you start a revolution, you're like, I don't know how this is gonna end up, right? If the war went the other way, they all would have been probably either hung or I don't know, have to buy their way out of it. But they had some differences. So key differences are the role of government. And, you know, we sort of talk about the key difference in the role of government is, should we have a strong federal government or should the state governments be more powerful? Now, almost all of the founders, and if you read accounts of the convention, knew the federal government had to be supreme and had to have some key powers. And so the real debate was like, should we have a narrow federal government that had some supremacy and some powers versus a broad federal government that had wide-ranging powers? So actually, Madison at the convention and Hamilton wanted the federal government to have these broad powers, whereas others like Roger Sherman, I think Pinckney, wanted to have a narrow, so the federal government still had basically a supremacy clause, but only over like a few key issues. So we think about this in like federal government versus states, and that's kind of right, because there were issues like, well, maybe the state should still rule over this. So basically strength of federal government versus states' rights, I guess. This idea of like the few versus the many, should we have, how much should the people be involved in the government? And we end up with a combination, right? So we have the legislative branch, or at least the House, one chamber of the legislative branch has direct elections at the time. The Senate at the time is senators are chosen by the state legislatures. But most of the other elected offices, like the presidency, is very indirect. So few versus the many. Questions and disagreements over how economy should function. Should we be agrarian versus industry? And sort of industry is starting to take off, but you know, should every individual have their own farm and they sort of contribute, or should you work for someone else? And that's probably the way to think about agrarian versus industry. You know, are there business owners versus everyone is their own business? And so the Federalists are more in favor of industry, and that had to do with they were more a northern, northeastern New England party versus the Democratic Republicans, who are more agrarian or anti-Federalist. The Democratic Republicans and anti-Federalists kind of go together. And then questions about like debtors versus creditors. So farmers tend to be debtors, right? Where they take on debt to sort of plant crops and buy equipment and whatnot. So who should reign, or should creditors, right? The people who have the capital who loan. These were some of the questions that came into play. Then who should our foreign friends be? So the Federalists thought England should be our main country that we work with, which is a little strange, right? Just sort of fight a war to like become independent from them. And they're like, well, it's fine. Like, we can be friends, right? We'll just be independent but friends. Versus should France, who actually helped the US during the Revolutionary War, should they be the main country that we work with? And the Federalists and Hamilton were pro-England. The anti-Federalists, or Democratic Republicans, are pro-France. So that's sort of Jefferson versus Hamilton again. I should say this would probably make like a good short answer question on an exam, right? Like, list some similarities and differences about the founders. So real quick, we'll talk about like what is a republic. And so a republic is a government where sovereignty is the right to rule, comes from the people. So if this was a lecture class, I would say like, hey, what are some options for government? But the key thing to remember about republic is, where does sovereignty come from? And sovereignty, the right to rule, comes from the people. And this is different from having a king or queen, where right to rule comes from, I don't know, like pulling a sword out of the lake or the stone or something, or like sovereignty comes from a supreme being, right? But in a republic type of government, sovereignty, and so this is small r, right? Not Republican Party, small r republic. Sovereignty comes from the people. And so other options are, again, like you could have a dictator where, I don't know, like sovereignty comes from force, right? Because you control the military. It could be king or queen, where sovereignty comes from, I don't know where it comes from, right? The god or something. But the one agreement amongst the founders, most of them, is we would have a republican form of government where sovereignty comes from the people. And so there was a debate, was this the correct choice for such a large nation, diverse states, right? So we had a very big country. Could you have a country with a government where sovereignty comes from the people, with like this federal government? You know, would it work if some of the states were like very far away? How would representation work if, you know, you had to figure out, what do my people want back, you know, and it might take you a week to get someplace, information slow to travel. But these are some of the debates. Or like, they're very diverse. We had agrarian parts of the country. We had industrial parts of the country. We had, you know, sort of slavery debate, North versus South. Now, again, we can talk about slavery. There was slavery in the North, but it's much more predominant in the South. So these are some of the debates that they had. I used to teach a course on the founding, and we would talk more about this. But they decided, like, yeah, I guess this will work, right? And it's probably better than all the alternatives. There's no perfect government. So real quick, you sometimes see this, like, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. So this is a false dichotomy. If someone says we're a republic, we're not a democracy. So a republic is this definition, a political order in which the supreme power lies in a body of citizens who are entitled to vote for officers and representatives responsible to them. So basically, republic is a type of government where sovereignty comes from the people. Democracy can take different forms. So, but democracy is still government by the people. And so democracy can either be direct, where individuals are voting on policy outcomes, or indirect, which we have, through elected representatives, right? So democracy, similar to republic, sovereignty comes from the people, but there's different ways democracies can work. And so democracies work, at least in the US, through elected representatives. So are we a democracy or a republic? Like, no, we're both. So I don't know, this just bothers me sometimes. People say we're not a democracy or a republic. Now, the founders sometimes thought about democracy as pure democracy, right? Where every person in the country who was given a vote would decide on outcomes. And we're not a pure democracy, right? We don't have pure majoritarian rule. but we are a democracy because government is exercised through elected representatives where sovereignty comes from the people. So anyways, have to talk about that. Okay, so issues of the Constitutional Convention. So of course, issue of slavery comes up at the Constitutional Convention. Largely, it's the southern states that are more pro-slavery. Northern states are less. And the issue of slavery comes up in different ways. And part of this is through representation, right? So the idea of representation is how many individuals will be representing the different states in the government, right? So how should this be counted? You know, again, the lower chamber of the House is based off of population. So we do come up with the 3/5 compromise where, so the South wanted slaves to be counted in terms of representation. So they would say, well, you know, there's this many free people, this many slaves, we add them all up, and then we determine how many representatives the state gets. The North was the opposite. They said slaves should not be counted, right? So if slaves were counted as representation, the South would get more representatives in the government and would be more powerful. So both sides saw this. So one thing is they come up with the 3/5 compromise. And actually the 3/5 comes over from the Articles of Confederation, where they had a question about taxes, and taxes were based off of population in the Articles, and the 3/5 compromise was actually part of the Articles of Confederation and rolls over into the Constitution. And then there's also questions about the continuation of the slave trade. So one thing though, that at the convention, they knew like there's no way they would say like, well, we're gonna rule out having slavery moving forward, because the South would not agree to that in the Constitution. And so they knew they would have to come to a compromise and 3/5, and there's also terms about sort of when the slave trade itself would end. But racial issues have always divided the country. So you could think about it, the convention, the Constitutional Convention, Civil War, Reconstruction, civil rights. I mean, think about today, right? So one of the key differences between I think the Democratic Party and the Republican Party today is over racial issues. You could go back to the Civil Rights era, and there was differences between the Democratic Party, largely in the South, was you know, anti-civil rights, and you know the parties basically switched on the issues during a realignment, where the South now is largely Republican, for the most part, and then the North and other parts of the country are more Democratic, especially in cities. And if you look at, as we get into like later questions about polls and voting, the Democratic coalition is a much more diverse coalition than the Republican on racial issues than the Republican Party. So racial issues have like always divided the country in some fashion. Questions about representation, and some are about slavery, but other just sort of, and we won't go into detail, but like general questions about like how will representation work, right? How many representatives for each state? What's the upper chamber going to look like? How long are people going to serve? So these are questions about representation. Who would be more dominant, large states or small states? So again, if you read sort of the accounts of the Constitutional Convention, you know, depending on how you calculate how many representatives per each state, maybe large states do better versus small states. And they spent a lot of time debating this at the convention. Economics, and I talked about this already, but the idea of like, you know, we have an agrarian society, we have an industrial society, is business versus individuals. And the answer is we sort of end up with all of this, but like sort of business interests have always been dominant in our economy, sometimes more dominant than at other times. Another issue at the convention was this idea of the spirit of '76 versus the Constitution. So another way to think about this is the revolution had these ideals of freedom and liberty and individual rule. And so these are basically good propaganda to convince people it's a good idea to overthrow the current government. But then when it actually comes down to governing, you're like, oh, we probably have to restrict these somewhat, right? Like governing is in some ways taking away rights from individuals. to rule over them, right? And so we could talk about the social contract. Do we give up these rights in order to have our government function better, right? If you had a government as dictatorship, you can do exactly what you want, but like few freedoms and liberties for individuals. So these two sort of are at odds, like having to actually have a functioning government versus how much freedom and liberty do individuals have. We still don't have like a good answer to this, right? People are like, oh, the government can't make me wear a mask. It's taking away my freedom and liberty. So the government want to think about like, all right, yes, we'll restrict freedom somehow to make you wear a mask, but that's because we have this public health issue. And so there's always constraints in government of individual actions versus collective action. So what might be good for the whole would have to restrict individual freedoms and liberty to make outcomes better for the whole. Because individuals are like generally aren't very good at acting out something that's good for the group outcome. They're good for looking out for themselves. And you can say like, well, Adam Smith says the invisible hand, like, I don't know, this invisible hand doesn't always work. Another sort of question that comes up, like the founders have any authority to make the changes? So there was this prior document, the Articles of Confederation, that set up the sort of existing government. And these folks got together, they're like, okay, maybe we need some fixes. And they decide we're going to scrap the other document and come up with a new one. So the founders would say, and again, there was some agreement amongst the founders that, okay, the way we'll say we have the authority to make these changes is our document has to be ratified, and it'll be ratified by these ratification conventions that are made up sort of people. So the people of the states ratify the document. I guess that's why we accept it. We sort of just, well, this is it. This is what we go with. So just some things that come up from the Founding Brothers book that you read some chapters from is this idea of like why was America going to work, right? So it was a very different country with ideas than Europe. And Europe is probably the best comparison here because most of the people in, with the exception of slaves, right, sort of the people who were part of the founding were European. So why was America destined for greatness? And so one was, like with this huge country with lots and lots of land. So if you were coming from Europe, for many Europeans, the idea of actually owning land wasn't going to happen because the lords or whatever controlled lots of the land. Not all of it, right? Read a real interesting book on the plague that actually individuals were able to own land after one of the plagues because lots of people died and there was land available. But anyways, for the most part, it was much harder, especially England and France, for regular people to own land. There was tons of land in the US, taking it from Native Americans, but there was tons of land that was out there. Again, like we have these issues of slavery and Native Americans were here. They're not difficult to talk about, but sort of run counter to some of these things. So I'm cognizant of that. America was far from other countries. So, Europe, the European countries are always like fighting each other. America was far from Europe. So if you want to fight a war with America, like it was harder to do. You could do it from Canada for the most part. And then later on through Mexico, that's sort of a quasi-war via Spain. But anyways, America's far. So they have sort of time to do what they want and be left alone. Lots of people wanted to come to America, and lots of them were very young. So the average age of Americans was much younger than in Europe. And I'm curious if this is still true today, but lots of people wanted to leave their country, take a risk, come to America and start over. Sort of we had the founders were willing to push things forward, willing to put some differences aside to break away from England. Now, eventually, like those differences, they stopped putting them aside and fight each other intellectually, but not in a war. And then Washington. So one thing that helped is I think people are in agreement that Washington will be the first leader of this new country rather than having a fight over who this person will be. And so the fights were more over details rather than personnel, at least as far as Washington was concerned. But there's lots of ways that America could considered to fail. So one is like, would England and King George actually sort of just let things go? You know, how would they divide up the land? And this question of like industry versus agrarian country, what's the best way for the economy? And what happened was like, well, let's just go with both, right? So southern agrarian and northern, which is more industrial and business. But, you know, sort of eventually, as I said, like the founders put differences aside and then they kind of quickly battle each other. But again, the battle is intellectual, right? Within the rules of the game and not going to war with each other. And then the sort of the question of slavery and racial issues, again, are always part of how our country works. And there's always fights over, not always fights, it's either always lurking in the background or to the forefront. So one thing at the beginning of our country was basically both sides agreed to like, well, let's not talk about slavery. And there's actually a whole like thing called the gag rule where in the legislature, they say, well, we're not gonna talk about this. We'll sort of just let the status quo happen. So they took one of the main issues of contention off the table. Terrible outcome, but it's sort of slowed down, you know, having a civil war, which eventually happens over slavery. So what allowed sort of this movement to continue, right? So lots of times if you sort of study history, you'll have a revolution where you overthrow the government, but then like everyone would agree like, okay, current government bad, but then all the sides who are against the current government will fight each other. And so the founders were willing to compromise and work within the rules of the game. And I talked about this some already. You know, we had these intellectual disagreements over, you know, individual liberty versus sacrifice to society, where Jefferson's on one side and Hamilton's on the other. So short term, Hamilton and Washington sort of have a stronger federal government, but then, and onto Adams, but then Jefferson and Madison take over and the Federalists sort of disappear as a party. And there's more, more siding with the idea of individual liberty, at least intellectually, but the federal government still is relatively strong, but states were still sort of the main governmental actor. They knew like couldn't let their disagreements let sort of the whole thing fail. And so they were willing to put some disagreements aside or again, work within the rules, sort of okay, we'll just let the elections and the votes happen. So they'd rather have America successful and maybe they lose a little bit on their ideas than fight each other. So they have very large egos, so they wanted to succeed. Also, they lost like the Revolutionary War at least, then like they would probably be hung. Some of my joke have superhuman powers. So Jefferson and Adams die on the 4th of July, 50 years after 1776, within like hours of each other. It's actually kind of interesting. One thing that was helpful for our country that's different from a lot of European countries is we didn't have an aristocracy. And so an aristocracy means like you sort of got to be part of the government based off of your birth, right? The House of Lords is based off of birth. Whereas in America, we didn't have this like landed gentry that controlled all the wealth, or at least there's an opportunity to get wealth. And you could will it down, but you weren't rich just because of your birth. So this lack of aristocracy, there was a lack of people who are sort of just vested in maintaining the status quo. It's helpful, right? So it's harder to have a revolution if there's people who are much more vested in maintaining the status quo who also control all the wealth. So the lack of aristocracy meant, you know, people like Washington and Jefferson and Hancock we don't talk about, but like they had a lot of wealth, but were like okay with changing things. I thought they could probably get richer. And we talk a lot about slavery, and basically the idea was they would push the issue off the table once they worked through the Three-Fifths Compromise, push the issue off the table and agree not to talk about it. And of course, eventually that doesn't work out. And I've said this a few times already, it's unique the two sides, like the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, or Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, like didn't go to war with each other. That's because they were sort of willing to work within the rules. And think about this in the context of our current leadership. It's funny, actually, I probably wrote this slide like 8 years ago, 10 years ago, with some of these things, that our current leadership, like, they're not, on both sides, they're not willing to compromise, I don't think. They'd rather have like no outcome than sort of come to the middle on things. And so I think one of the fundamental problems with our government, and this is a lot within the legislature, is they won't vote on things. And so they're always worried about like, well, we vote on this, this will make our side look bad and we'll do bad in the next election. And so rather than let things come to a vote, like at the Constitutional Convention, you know, like, okay, we debate things and now we're gonna vote on it. And whoever wins the vote, like that's the outcome. Again, especially in the legislature, things just don't come to a vote, or maybe like one chamber votes on it, but the other chamber won't. And I think a lot of this is the Senate, right? So the House might pass something, it moves to the Senate, and right now McConnell, before when the Democrats under Harry Reid, they just won't vote on things. And they would blame the filibuster. The filibuster is not in the Constitution, right? You could make things come to a vote. And it's not just the leaders in the Senate, the rank and file, like give the power away to the leaders anyways. So anyways, one thing to think about, again, sort of just to wrap this up here, is the founders were willing to move forward, willing to come to outcomes, because that was better than just maintaining the status quo on things. And so it's a little bit about the founding, and lots of these questions we talked about, like how would business operate? You know, so should the government be like pro or anti-business, I guess? How much power should individuals have? North versus South, racial issues. These are still questions that the country grapples with today, and you could see it between the two parties, right? If you sat down and thought about some of these issues and the two parties, you could probably map them out pretty well. And it's happened from the beginning. And part of that is, especially questions about like individual liberty versus collective action, are fundamental to governing, and you can't solve these, but you can sort of like move past them and come to some agreement, which I think our current government is very, very troubling, that they can't come to agreement on things, or just like, well, let's just vote and end up somewhere in the middle. And part of that is the way the rules are structured now. We concentrate power in very few individuals. You can vote to change the rules, but they're unwilling to do that. So I'll stop. That's the founding. And then the next lecture will delve into the details of the Constitution.